51st Invocation of the Litany of the Blessed Virgin, Queen of Confessors, pray for us. By confessors we understand those saints who in the various situations and circumstances of life persevered with constancy in the confession of the faith and in the practice of virtue, and who proved themselves to be true disciples and faithful followers of Jesus Christ, not by the death of martyrs, but by a holy life. To the confessors belong the holy popes, bishops, and priests, the holy religious of both sexes, the holy kings and princes, the holy people of every station in life. In a word, all those saints who are no martyrs. More exalted than all confessors is Mary. She is their queen, because she fulfilled most perfectly the duties of religion, of her state of life, and of the love of her neighbor, and made the most excellent confession of Jesus Christ. True, the holy confessors fulfilled their duties with laudable zeal and fervor. Nothing pertaining thereto was indifferent to them. In nothing were they guilty of any negligence. Not a day passed in which they did not say their morning and evening prayers with great devotion. Frequently during the day they would collect their thoughts and direct them to God by recommending themselves to His protection and making acts of love. Many of them spent whole nights in pious meditations and fervent exercises of devotion. Not only on Sundays and holy days, but also on weekdays, they hastened to church and assisted at Holy Mass with a devotion which edified all. Whenever they could find a spare moment, they visited Jesus in the Blessed Eucharist, and the moments spent there were to them the sweetest in their life. They knew no greater happiness than to approach frequently the sacraments of penance and the Blessed Eucharist, for they recognized that these channels of grace are the most effectual means of freeing ourselves more and more from our faults and imperfections, of being strengthened in virtue, and of increasing in the love of God. Thus the confessors fulfilled their religious duties. But far above them stands Mary, the Blessed Virgin. Albert the Great says that after Jesus, his Blessed Mother practiced the virtue of prayer more perfectly than all the saints that ever have lived or ever will live, because she prayed continually and perseveringly. She practiced prayer from the first moment of her life, for at her birth she had already obtained the perfect use of her reason. Hence, as a child of 3 years, she would go to the temple in order to devote herself more exclusively to prayer. There she prayed, as she herself revealed to St. Elizabeth, at 3 different times of the day, and rose even in the middle of the night to adore God before the altar of the temple. In order to be able to meditate with greater devotion on the sufferings of Christ, she would often visit the places where her divine Son was born, where he suffered and was buried. Moreover, she always remained recollected in prayer, free from all distractions and attachments to the world. The Gospel itself furnishes us with many examples, showing with what admirable fervor she fulfilled her religious duties. The Mosaic law ordained that every male child should be circumcised on the 8th day after its birth. Mary was not obliged to observe this law, for the child to whom she had given birth was not a mere human child. He was the incarnate Son of God. Nevertheless, she had him circumcised, for her fervor urged her to do everything which she recognized as pleasing to God. How great must have been the sacrifice she made on this occasion! Is there one among all the confessors who has made such a sacrifice in the performance of his religious duties? 40 days after the birth of the divine infant, we find Mary in the Temple of Jerusalem, where again she complied with 2 precepts of the Mosaic law, the law of purification and the law concerning firstborn male children. There was not the least obligation upon Mary to comply with these 2 laws. It was not necessary for her to be purified, for she was not unclean, She had conceived the blessed fruit of her womb not in a natural manner, but by the power of the Holy Ghost. She submitted, however, to the law of purification, because thereby she found an opportunity to humble herself and return thanks to God for the grace of divine maternity. Neither was she bound to offer Jesus in the temple, for Christ, as the Son of God, was not subject to the law of Moses. But Mary's great love for us urged her to fulfill this law also. She even then offered him up for the salvation of the world, and manifested her will to God that his and her Son should die on the cross, that the sinful human race might be redeemed. Finally, the Gospel relates that Mary and Joseph went to Jerusalem every year to celebrate the Pasch, and that they took their child with them when he was 12 years old. When we consider that the journey from Nazareth to Jerusalem is through a mountainous country, and that about 30 hours are required to make it, we must admit that it must have been very laborious and fatiguing for Mary. She was not obliged to undertake this journey, for the law regarded only the men, not the women. In this regard also it was religious fervor and devotion alone that induced the Blessed Virgin to make this long and arduous journey every year. These few examples give us sufficiently to understand that the Blessed Virgin, in the performance of religious duties, by far excels all confessors, and that she is justly styled the Queen of Confessors. My dear Christian, you too should become a holy confessor, and therefore fulfill your religious duties. Love to pray. Prayer is for every Christian the first and most necessary requisite for salvation. I think, says St. Chrysostom, it is evident to all that without prayer it is simply impossible for anyone to live virtuously and to die holily. There is no saint in heaven who did not love to pray. But pray with devotion, for God despises a prayer which comes from the lips only. It is an abomination to him. Say your morning and evening prayers regularly every day. Raise your heart frequently to God. Promise him love and fidelity, and ask his grace. Cultivate a love for spiritual reading, for the perusal of such books is more beneficial and useful to you than the reading of novels and romances. Sanctify Sundays and holy days. Attend High Mass and Vespers. Hear sermons and devote at least a quarter of an hour to the adoration of Jesus in the Blessed Eucharist. Be fervent in the reception of the sacraments. Go to confession and communion as often as your confessor advises. Consider that you will preserve the fear of God and fervor and virtue only as long as you scrupulously comply with your religious duties. The confessors belonged to the most varied states of life and lived in the most varied situations, but they were all one in as far as they fulfilled the duties of their respective states with perfect fidelity. Some were princes, in whose rule justice went hand in hand with meekness, and who, as far as possible, were solicitous for the temporal and eternal welfare of their subjects. Others were ministers of state and officials who administered their respective offices with the greatest conscientiousness, edifying their inferiors by their good example. Some were priests, who proved themselves to be to all men, especially to their parishioners, counselors, teachers, comforters, and helpers in every need, who put forth all their energy to gain souls to God. Others were simply citizens, peasants, artisans, and laborers, who worked diligently in their avocation, patiently endured the hardships incident to their state of life, were honest, knew no envy, and whose hearts were with God while their hands were at work. Amongst them were husbands and wives who lived in peace and harmony with one another, who constantly looking upward had God ever before their eyes, and who assisted one another to rear their children piously and in his holy fear and love, who together maintained good order and discipline among their domestics, and strove to lead all under their charge to the path of virtue. Others were unmarried, and these, guarded against the desire to please, led a retired life, were fond of prayer, and endeavored to render their conduct morally pure and holy. With the same, yea, with far greater fervor, Mary fulfilled the duties of her state of life. Consider her in her single life, how careful she watched over her virginal purity. In truth, all the virtues were conspicuous in her: purity, modesty, humility, meekness, detachment, poverty, obedience, piety, fervent love of God, burning zeal for his glory, perfect submission to his adorable will, inexhaustible charity for her neighbor, patience in every trial. These were the bright gems with which the virginal Mother of God was adorned. Next, consider Mary as a mother. Where is there among all the mothers that we venerate as saints even one who fulfilled her maternal duties with such zeal and devotedness as did Mary, the divinest of mothers? What did she not do for her dear Jesus? At the word of her husband, "We must flee with haste into Egypt, for Herod seeks the life of the child," she scarcely waited for him to add that the angelic messenger had brought the tidings, but began and finished the requisite preparations, and while yet the star's pale glitter is their only light, they have set out on their long and perilous journey. Ah, yes, she is ever a faithful mother to Jesus. With the most affectionate solicitude she ministers to his wants, and labors from early dawn till late at night to procure for him the necessaries of life. The Lord ordained that she should lose her son when he was 12 years old in Jerusalem, and disregarding fatigue, hunger, and thirst, overwhelmed with feelings of anguish, longing, and love, she seeks him for 3 long days. Even after he has begun his public life, she is a faithful mother to him, and though she cannot accompany him everywhere, her heart is always with him. In the extremity of his tortures, the enemies of the adorable sufferer cast upon him derision, contempt, and bravadoes the most audacious. Must not Mary, standing at the foot of the infamous gibbet, have been mixed up by them with him in the same sentiments of hatred and the same insults? Oh, how often did not the insults offered the son recoil cruelly upon the mother? Consider Mary in her widowhood. Truly no widow has ever fulfilled as exactly as did Mary the words of the apostle: "She that is a true widow indeed and desolate, let her hope in God, and continue in supplications and prayers night and day." She often repaired to Calvary and to those holy places sanctified by the sufferings of her Son, and there prayed to God to have mercy on men. Her eyes were continually directed to things above. Her only desire was to be dissolved and to be with Christ. Thus Mary is the most perfect model of fidelity in the discharge of the duties of her state of life, and is in truth the Queen of Confessors. My dear Christian, conscientiously fulfill the duties of your state of life. It would be a great error if, supposing them to be of no consequence, you neglect them. If you do not fulfill the duties of your state of life, you sin against God, whose will is that every one should do what his state imposes upon him as a duty. Therefore, he is an evil-disposed man who does not labor in the situation in which God has placed him. You sin against human society, of which you are a member, and which you injure more or less by neglecting to do your whole duty. How prejudicial it is to communities when fathers of families, either by idleness or by living beyond their means, reduce their families to beggary, when parents rear their children badly, when unmarried people are given to licentiousness. You sin against yourself. A hard life in this world, a terrible destiny in the next. Behold what awaits you. Be content with your state, and patiently bear its hardships, for you are not in the world to enjoy a life of ease. Comply with whatever your state prescribes, for the love of God. Make a good intention in the morning that you will labor not for earth, but for heaven. Whilst fulfilling the duties of your state, do not neglect the duties of religion, for they must go hand in hand if you desire to be saved. The holy confessors confessed Christ especially by a sincere and active love for their neighbor. Mindful of the words of Christ, "By this all men shall know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another," they were inflamed with the most affectionate love towards their fellow men, and were ever intent upon doing them good. There was no corporal work of mercy which they did not practice. They fed the hungry, clothed the naked, consoled and comforted the sick, and aided all the unfortunate according to their ability. But with far greater fervor did they practice the spiritual works of mercy. When there was any question of saving souls, no sacrifice was too great for them. Many of them founded religious orders and societies, and numberless benevolent institutions, whereby they were enabled to transmit to posterity the fruits of their love for their neighbor. But however much the holy confessors excelled in their love for their neighbor, Mary surpasses them all. Suetonius relates of the Emperor Titus that he was so intent upon giving his subjects proofs of his favor that on those days in which he had no opportunity of doing good to others, he was very sad and used to say, "My friends, I have lost a day." If it were possible, however, that Mary, our Queen, could pass a day without bestowing graces upon us, she certainly would speak in a similar manner, and for the simple reason that she is thoroughly imbued with fraternal charity and the wish to do good to all. Her desire to distribute graces is far more ardent than our wish to receive them from her. Wherefore, every time we have recourse to her, we find her full of mercy and grace. If we peruse the pages of history, we will find in every century, nay, in every decennium, numberless examples which loudly proclaim the goodness and mercy of Mary. Among many others, I shall mention only one. A pious widow who lived in France frequently received visits from a friend of her deceased husband. This friend was an old general, a very excellent man in the eyes of the world, but a person of no religious belief whatever. He entertained a high opinion of the widow of his friend and would have done her any favor in his power. On one point only this lady could not prevail upon or influence him, namely in religion and religious practices. One day, when he came, he informed her that an important affair called him to Paris, where he had not been for 20 years. Then he spoke at length on the pleasures which he anticipated in the capital. The lady listened to him attentively, and then asked him if he would not do her a special favor on his arrival in Paris, and before attending to anything else. The general pledged his word of honor that he would do the errand, and asked what it was. "My commission," she said, "is not a difficult one, neither will it occupy much of your time. When you arrive at Paris, you will have the kindness to visit the church of Our Lady of Victories, and there, before the altar of Mary, say for me 5 Our Fathers and 5 Hail Marys." "What is it you ask, madam?" replied the general. "You commission me, an old soldier, to kneel down like an old woman before the Blessed Virgin? Can you not say these prayers yourself, or request one of your lady friends who goes to Paris with me?" "No, General," said the lady, "it cannot be otherwise. You must say the prayers." The lady reminded him of his word of honor which he had pledged her. He finally consented to grant her request. He said to himself, "This is a singular errand on which I am sent." He set out on his journey, consoling himself with the probability that his friends, who seldom or never visited a church, would not encounter him while he was redeeming this strange promise. Having arrived at Paris, he directed his steps to the Church of Our Lady of Victories. He entered, approached the altar, renowned for so many and such great victories, and knelt, however, before having looked around in order to assure himself that he had not been observed by any of his acquaintances. As he was about to begin the prayers he had been requested to say, he was seized with an inexpressible confusion. He stammered the first words, stopped, began anew, broke down again, and finally succumbed to the emotion which he could not control. In vain he tried to leave the church. An invisible hand held him back. In the meantime, he succeeded in gaining some control over himself, entered the sacristy. He sought the venerable pastor, acquainted him with his commission, told him of his confusion, and finally asked his advice regarding all that had happened. The worthy priest had at once divined the whole secret, and without reserve said to the general, "Mary, the mother of sinners, wishes to receive you into the number of her children. My dear friend, do not resist the grace which is held out to you, but begin by making a good confession." "But, Reverend Father," replied the general, "how shall I confess? I shall never be able to recall to mind what I've done since the day of my first communion." And his voice faltered. He had never been to confession since his first communion. "Sit down by me," the priest replied, "and let us talk together confidentially. You've been a soldier, and I know what you may have done during your busy life." Brought thus far, the old soldier, without further admonition or encouragement, sincerely and without reserve, disclosed his inner life to the worthy pastor, adding to every sin which he confessed, "Ah, if I could undo it, I would never commit it again." In the course of an hour, the priest said to him, "Well, my friend, you see that it is after all not so very difficult to confess. You've now made your confession." "How is it possible?" exclaimed the general. The priest replied, "Now make an act of contrition for all your sins. Perform the penance I will enjoin upon you, and return the day after tomorrow, that I may give you absolution and administer to you the body of the Lord." The general punctually followed the injunction of the priest, was converted and reconciled to God. He hastened to arrange the business that had brought him to Paris, then returned home, and lost no time in relating to the pious widow all the wonderful circumstances of his conversion. My dear Christian, follow in the footsteps of the holy confessors and of the Blessed Virgin Mother of God, and show yourself charitable toward your neighbor. Consider that Christ receives every act of charity to others as if done to himself. Should this not stimulate you to aid everyone who is in need according to your ability? Would you reject Christ if he were standing at your door? Would you refuse him the act of charity which he would ask of you? Consider, moreover, that you cannot acquire God's grace and mercy in a higher degree than when you show yourself kind and charitable towards the needy. And remember finally that your reward in heaven will be more glorious the more good you do to your neighbor. Give, and it shall be given to you. Good measure, and pressed down, and shaken together, and running over, shall they give unto your bosom.